These systems like ChatGPT have emerged very quickly and become popular very quickly. They can do a lot of really cool things for us, but they also pose some risks. We're going to think about some of those risks, starting with this question of whether models are always right. We've talked about this a little bit. Here's an example that I found of one place where it gets something wrong. And this is something fairly low stakes. We ask it, how many films has Arnold Schwarzenegger played the Terminator in? Give me a number and then list the movies. If you get it to commit to a number like 3 films, then it'll give you a list, but it actually missed some of the more recent movies that he was in. So knowing exactly how many times he played the Terminator is probably not so important, but if we ask it about more important things, like if we're a doctor and we want to use a system like this to help diagnose a patient, we can imagine that a mistake like this could be very, very bad. There's also a question of fairness within these models. There's questions that we can ask them that bring up notions of stereotypes, biases, things like that. And there's been a lot of work on the part of OpenAI to try to make them kind of walk a line between doing what you want and not being offensive and things like that. So if we ask it, tell me a blonde joke, it'll say, sure, here's a lighthearted, non-offensive blonde joke for you. Why don't blondes take their coffee to go? Because they're afraid it might take longer to walk than to brew the coffee. So offensive is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. So some people may take offense at this and some people may think it's funny. If we ask it for a joke about Jewish people, we get a slightly different answer. It says, of course, but let me clarify that it's important to make sure that any humor involving ethnic, religious, or cultural groups is respectful and good-natured. So it told us this in this case, but not in the blonde case, right? And Jewish people are historically more discriminated against than blonde people, but there's still a question of exactly where we draw these lines around what groups should kind of get this more respectful treatment versus not. And these models are trained on all this data from the internet. And so to some extent, this is very fundamental. They'll always encode this information about jokes about different cultural stereotypes, right? Because they have seen it before. They've seen all this kind of stuff on the web. And so even if the model won't necessarily surface it for you, it's still in there. It's still somewhere in the parameters of the language model are associations between Jewish people and certain stereotypes, things like that. Another question is the impact these models are having on the environment. If we use ChatGPT as a replacement for Google, it takes 100 times more energy to execute a query than a Google search does, partially because of all these parameters and all these layers of the transformer neural net architecture that I've talked about. And training these models can also be expensive and have a high carbon footprint. Llama 2, which is a ChatGPT-like model that was trained by Meta, produced 539 metric tons of CO2, which is equivalent to 3 plane flights from New York to San Francisco, like the whole plane flying. So these are not yet on the scale of things like agriculture or energy production or air travel or things like that in terms of impact. You know, this was a big expensive model and it was only 3 planes, which is, you know, what many airline carriers will fly in a single day on that single route. But this is something that's on the rise and a lot of folks are concerned about it. Another thing is the potential impact on society. There are worries that ChatGPT could cause people to be unemployed because the rise of artificial intelligence could result in certain types of jobs being things that are kind of replaceable by these systems. And the writers' strike in Hollywood is in large part due to fears of AI being used more heavily by studios and how creatives are going to kind of have job security and sort of navigate this space around these rising AI tools. There are other products that people are producing that have some kind of risks as well. This site called Replica gave people access to AI chatbot companions, and they found that users were falling in love with these chatbots, right? So we're releasing these systems and we don't know how people are going to use them and don't know how people are going to react to them. So I want you to think about, of the things that we've talked about here, or of other things that you've heard about, what are the potential harms of ChatGPT that you can imagine? What are you worried about? What do you think impacts you and your community? That's the end of this segment.